This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson, and in the early hours of Friday the 30th of November, these are our main stories. Donald Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress about contacts with Russia. As we record this podcast, Israeli warplanes are reported to have bombed several areas in Syria. There's been no confirmation from the Israeli military. Also in this podcast, the growing menace of measles, which kills and blinds children around the world, according to the WHO. And
Stocks Hotel has opened itself for the elderly, the infirm and the sick.
Emergency measures on the small Channel island of Sark off the English coast as the local power company says they'll pull the plug, but will the lights stay on? We start with this.
Mr. Cohen has cooperated. Mr. Cohen will continue to cooperate. Sentencing is set for December 12th.
It could be a turning point in the long investigation as to whether Russia interfered in the 2016 US election. President Trump's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, has pleaded guilty to misleading the US Congressional Committee carrying out that inquiry. What you heard there was his lawyer, Guy Petrillo, saying his client will continue cooperating with the investigation. So, looking tired and drawn, Mr. Cohen admitted to making a false statement about Mr. Trump's real estate business in Russia and withholding other information. President Trump, though, was quick to try to discredit his former lawyer's new testimony.
He was convicted with a fairly long-term sentence on things totally unrelated to the Trump Organization, having to do with mortgages and having to do with cheating the IRS, perhaps, a lot of different things. I don't know exactly, but he's a weak person, and what he's trying to do is get a reduced sentence. So he's lying about a project that everybody knew about.
Our correspondent in Washington, Chris Buckler, told me more about what Mr. Cohen had to say.
Michael Cohen was called by President Trump today a weak and not very smart person. But the truth is at one time he was heavily involved in his business dealings. He was the personal lawyer and also regarded as being a man who would sort problems out for President Trump. And what he was talking about in court today were allegations about what exactly happened as regards a business deal that was proposed in Moscow. The Trump Organization were looking at building a so-called Moscow Trump Tower. And basically that real estate deal was being discussed in 2015 into 2016. And before, Michael Cohen said that there was no conversation about it after January 2016. That's when the conversations ended. He now says actually those conversations continued into summer 2016. That's when the presidential campaign was well underway. And he also says that despite suggesting he didn't have contact with Russia, in fact he had a conversation with a member of the Kremlin in January 2016. And the suggestions are that that was set up in conversation with some of those involved in Vladimir Putin's own press office.
Yeah, the important thing is to remember what people actually said back then. I've got a tape for you. Let's go back 2 years and hear a little of what Mr. Trump had to say at the time in question in 2016. Here he is in October of that year during the presidential election campaign.
I know nothing about Russia. I know about Russia, but I know nothing about the inner workings of Russia. I don't deal there. I have no businesses there. I have no loans from Russia.
He's being pretty clear there. Chris, what can we read into that?
Yeah, I suppose it's the argument about what are business dealings. The argument from Donald Trump today is that everybody knew that at one stage he was thinking about a Moscow development, that they were looking at a real estate deal there, that the deal never actually happened. But of course, what Robert Mueller, in this special counsel investigation looking into allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election and, of course, allegations of collusion involving the Trump campaign, what he's looking at are business dealings, relationships, what conversations were being had by Russia during that 2016 period. And that's why he has now got this information from Michael Cohen as part of a plea deal.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence then for a Russian connection. Can President Trump really continue to brave this out?
Well, he continues to say that there is no collusion, that there was no conflict of interest, no obstruction of justice. Those are all of the things that he's been consistent about saying. I suspect that they will be a little bit rattled. They'll regard Michael Cohen as a problem, if only because he is saying these things. Ultimately, they claim, President Trump claims, that Michael Cohen is lying. But it all adds to these questions about what Robert Mueller actually knows, what Robert Mueller has evidence of. And the frustrating thing for President Trump is, just like us, he doesn't seem to have any idea.
Emily Bazelon is a fellow at Yale Law School. So just how significant does she think this development is?
It's very significant. I mean, we're talking about the president's personal lawyer, and the facts of this involving Trump's business dealings with Russia are, famously something that he had categorically denied. In the campaign, he said no, and essentially, I think, wanted the American people to think that other than the beauty pageant he'd sponsored in Russia, that this was not part of the Trump organization's portfolio. Now that's clearly shown not to be the case. And what's more, the timing of these negotiations over this potential deal, they go much further on the timeline. They go through 2016, through the election. And so there are these internal contradictions here to sort out, for sure.
Right. But in terms of laws being broken, there's absolutely no evidence that Mr. Trump, for example, directed Michael Cohen to lie to Congress on his behalf.
That's right. We don't have any evidence of that. And so I think if that's your bar, then it has not been met. I think there are other questions and standards about honesty and the way in which the president has characterized his relations in Russia, his business relations, how that affects his dealings with Putin. There's really a kind of political consequence and context for this that is separate from the legal issues, but also important. And, generally, this is something that keeps coming up in the Mueller investigation. If the only test is, has someone broken the law? So far, President Trump has not been shown to have broken the law, or the prosecutors haven't alleged that. And yet, that really the only standard that's relevant here?
But I guess also what we don't know is what was the content of President Trump's written submissions to the Mueller inquiry, which, after all, were only handed over, I think, a short time before Michael Cohen made his admission today in court.
Yes, that's true. Now, the president's lawyers are saying that he told Mueller in his written answers about this business deal. Oddly, they say that Mueller didn't ask about the timing, and so they didn't answer that, which seems strange because the timing is one of the crucial factors here in terms of evaluating what the president was doing during the campaign, how much that matters, how to think about it. That seems highly relevant. So I'm not sure whether I believe the lawyers that there was no question about this from the special counsel. Eventually, I suppose we'll find out.
Emily Bazelon speaking to the BBC's Tim Franks. As we record this podcast, Israeli warplanes are reported to have bombed several areas in Syria. The details from our Arab Affairs editor, Sebastian Usher.
The Syrian state media said that its air defences had opened fire on what it called enemy targets, didn't specify actually which enemy that was. Other reports from inside the country said essentially that these were Israeli airstrikes, missiles as well. This is something that we've seen a lot in the past from Israel. The targets appear to have been in the south of Syria, near the Golan, and also just to the south of Damascus. These are areas where we believe pro-Iranian militias and Hezbollah have weapons depots. As I say, those have been targeted regularly throughout the war by Israel without really pulling the government into any greater confrontation. But back in September, there was an incident in which Syrian air defences were opening fire on just such an air raid, and they accidentally shot down a Russian plane. Now, Moscow blamed Israel for that, and in response, Moscow, of course, being a very close ally of the Syrian government, they gave Syria a much more sophisticated air defence system. Now, we don't believe that that's yet in operation because the Syrian air defence hasn't been trained for it. So this appears to be over for now, but it is a reigniting of that area of conflict between Israel and particularly Iran's proxies in Syria.
Sebastian Usher. A convicted murderer in Texas has confessed to 90 murders dating back to the 1970s, which, if confirmed, would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. The authorities say they've matched the confessions of Samuel Little, who's 78, to 34 killings so far. From New York, Neda Tawfik reports.
Samuel Little was first taken into custody on a drugs charge in 2012. DNA samples then linked him to the unsolved murders of 3 women in Los Angeles in the late 80s. After a trial, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. But the FBI uncovered compelling links to other cold cases. During the course of an interview earlier this year, Little went through a list of cities, admitting to killing a number of people in each place. 90 in total over decades without suspicion from authorities. He mainly preyed upon drug addicts and prostitutes. According to the FBI, he remembered the killings in great detail. The former boxer knocked out his victims with powerful punches and then strangled them. Because there were no obvious signs of murder, such as bullet or stab wounds, many of the deaths were not investigated or were classified as accidents or drug overdoses.
Neda Tawfik. Some worrying health news now. Measles is making a comeback. That's despite a cheap and effective vaccine that's been available since the 1960s. According to the World Health Organization, there was a spike in cases last year, with Europe, the Americas and the Eastern Mediterranean seeing the biggest increases. The disease is highly contagious and potentially fatal. It can lead to swelling of the brain, severe diarrhoea and blindness. Babies or malnourished young children with weak immune systems are particularly vulnerable to complications and death. Our global health correspondent is Smita Mundasad.
I was speaking to an expert from the WHO earlier, and he was really disappointed because for years cases have been declining. They thought they were making progress. But he's now really worried that in lots of different parts of the world, there is this resurgence, and you have to look at the different reasons in different areas. So let's take the Americas. In Venezuela, there's been loads of cases, and that's partly because the health system's collapsed after all the economic and political problems there. If we move to Europe, he's worried that actually it's down to a lot of parents not vaccinating their children, and he thinks that a lot of this
scare stories around on social media.
A lot of this is down to the social media and how quickly that can spread the false, unfounded stories that vaccines are unsafe. But on top of that,
because it is nonsense, isn't it? Absolute nonsense.
These vaccines have been given to millions of children worldwide. The WHO calculates they've saved 21 million lives in the last 17 years. And the other problem here as to why there's this resurgence is that people have forgotten in maybe the kind of rich industrialised countries about how bad measles can get. Lots of people just think, oh, it's a bit of a rash. It goes away in a few days, a couple of spots. They've forgotten, they don't see anymore that measles can cause blindness, it can cause swelling of the brain, it can lead to death. And that's why this vaccine, these experts are saying, is so important.
And 110,000 deaths, of course, mainly children last year. What's the WHO going to do?
The WHO says, well, lots more effort, lots more money needs to go into this. So obviously in the places where it's all about the health system's not working, then there needs to be much more political will, lots more money going in to build those back up so that people can get those vaccines that they desperately need. In places where it's about scare stories and social media, this expert I spoke to said, well, maybe we're just not communicating properly. We need to find better ways to counteract the rubbish that's on social media about vaccines. We need to find ways to convince people that they're safe, that they can save lives, and that just spreading this misinformation isn't worth it.
This is fake news that really does matter.
Makes a huge difference and can sadly lead to lots of death. I mean, 20 years ago now is when Wakefield, a scientist, came up with completely unfounded, now completely discredited research suggesting that the MMR vaccine was unsafe and was linked to autism. That is not true. It's been proven by lots and lots of scientists that that isn't true. But the problem now is that these scare stories can be spread so much quicker and they can go global.
Smita Mundasad. You're listening to the Global News Podcast on the BBC World Service. Still to come, life expectancy is falling in the United States after rising through most of the 20th century. What's gone wrong? Although the population of Pakistan is more than 200 million, fewer than 1% pay anything but nominal tax. The new Prime Minister, Imran Khan, has made tax collection a priority, and now the Pakistani authorities say that filing tax returns is a prerequisite for anyone wanting to get promoted in the military. Our South Asia editor is Anbarasan Etarajan.
Tax collection is a huge problem in the subcontinent. The Pakistani authorities are now trying to encourage more people to pay their income tax, and they're showcasing the military, the powerful military, to say even the Pakistani military officers are going to be paying more tax. More officers and more military people will come into this tax net. They're telling people because in the next couple of days, that is the last date for the filing the returns. So they're encouraging more people to show that tax collection is essential.
There's also a stick in here too, isn't there? Because they're also saying to the military, if you don't pay your tax, you're not going to get any more promotions.
There has been a criticism within Pakistan that the Pakistani military, it's not only a powerful military, it also runs lots of businesses. So people are questioning whether the military is paying taxes for the business establishments.
I suppose to look at it this though, from the point of view of the average Pakistani, he or she might say, well, look, if I don't pay tax, that's more money for me, which I need. If I do pay tax, then I'm poorer. What's in it for me? Why should I want to pay more tax?
There is a lack of information, lack of awareness among the population, not only in Pakistan, but also in other parts of South Asia, because people will always question, okay, if I'm going to pay the tax, what I'm going to get in return? Because, we talk about the mismanagement and the bad governance issues. The corruption, all these issues are there. That's why people keep asking, we pay taxes, for example, buying a car, I pay the sales tax. If I'm buying a refrigerator, I buy another, like a VAT, I'm paying additional taxes. But what am I getting in return? I see the politicians becoming richer, and how they earn the money, it's all in questionable means.
And sometimes it's a fair point, isn't it?
If I'm going to give it back to the government, what I will get in return, because the money is being wasted in a variety of ways.
And is there an answer that will satisfy them?
Getting people to file their income tax return is very, very important in the region, because people are used to this informal economy. Everything works under the counter, like you pay cash and take the product, or you work and you get paid in cash. So this is one of the biggest challenges for the governments in the region, to encourage more people to pay their income tax.
Anbarasan Etarajan. Life expectancy in the United States increased for much of the 20th century, but now it's decreasing. A rise in the number of suicides and fatal drug overdoses has been blamed. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the average lifespan fell to 78.6 years in 2017, a marginal decrease from the previous year. Sir Michael Marmot is one of the world's leading health experts and Professor of Epidemiology at University College London. He spoke to my colleague Dan Damon from Hong Kong, where he was attending a conference on life expectancy.
It's not a surprise in the sense that it's now 3 years in a row that life expectancy has declined in the US. So we saw it over the 2 years before this one. But it is a surprise in that we expect richer countries to have better health. And we've just done a review of health in the Americas. The US is by far the richest country in the Americas, but there are 8 other countries that have longer life expectancy than the United States, including countries like Chile, Costa Rica, Cuba, that are much poorer, have much lower income than the US, but better health.
People listening to this will consider the likelihood that obesity would be one of the explanations, but that seems not to be offered in this case. It is instead the drug overdoses and suicides. How do you read that?
Well, my general approach is that the health of a population tells us something fundamentally important about the nature of society. And if the US is lagging behind other rich countries and now having a decline in life expectancy, it suggests that something's going wrong. When Anne Case and Angus Deaton a few years ago drew attention to the rise in mortality in middle-aged white men and women in the United States, it was drug overdoses, suicide, and alcoholic liver disease, and they called it deaths of despair. And it looks like these deaths of despair, drug overdose and suicide, are continuing to increase. It means that something's going wrong. And what we know about the US figures is the fewer the years of education, the steeper the rise. So it means people who are feeling disempowered, left behind, are experiencing this increase in mortality, decrease in life expectancy.
Japan has one of the highest life expectancies, 85 years, I think. How would you explain the difference?
We could explain it in proximate terms that Japan doesn't have the drug overdose that the US has, but I look at it in a more fundamental way. Has less inequalities, has a number of features. It is more socially cohesive than the US, and I think those are very important factors. I'm sitting here in Hong Kong as we speak. Hong Kong just overtook Japan as having longer life expectancy, which is confounding to the normal ways of thinking about these things. And we need to understand why it's no longer simply a matter of rich countries, good health, middle-income countries, poorer health. There are other factors in society that are really vitally important, hence the rise of drug overdose, suicide.
Sir Michael Marmot. Well, if you want to slow the ageing process, the kind of exercise you do is important. German researchers say you should forget pumping iron and lifting weights and take up running instead. The newsroom's Richard Hamilton explains why.
Scientists from the universities of Leipzig and Homburg looked at telomeres. These are structures inside our cells which prevent them from deteriorating. They are regarded as cellular clocks because they're shorter in the elderly than they are in younger people. The scientists found that running can increase the length of these telomeres. Dr. Christian Werner from the University of Homburg explained how they carried out their research.
The unique thing about our project is that it is the first randomized controlled study in this field where we prospectively trained unsportive individuals who were about 50 years of age, and we started a training program of 6 months and we randomized them. That is like a lottery to a control group who did not take up sports for 6 months, or aerobic running, or interval training, that is like jogging and fast running interspersed. And we compared it to resistance training, which is like weightlifting, 3 times a week for 45 minutes. And before and afterwards, we measured cellular aging. What really struck us, and which we didn't expect, is that there was really a striking difference between endurance training, which is aerobic running, compared to resistance training.
In a completely unscientific test, I ventured down to the BBC gym, not with my running shoes, but with a microphone, to put this theory to a number of my colleagues who were pounding the treadmills.
I'm not going to argue with the scientists. Oh, they do different things, I think, yeah. I just feel exhausted after both.
Well, I'm not a scientist, but I run every day and I feel good as a result of doing it.
I used to be friends with a runner and she actually got the opposite information about that. She actually was told the impact from the running affects your face and how it ages your face as well. And she felt that because she was a marathon runner that it actually had aged her more. She had the physique of a 19-year-old, but in terms of the impact it has on your skin, what she thought it aged her face more.
The German scientists emphasised, though, that they are not recommending that we give up resistance training altogether. They add that lifting weights strengthens our bones and the muscles that protect them. But unlike running, it does not reverse the ageing process.
Richard Hamilton. Later on Friday, a tiny island in the Channel Islands could be plunged into darkness. Sandwiched between France and the UK, the residents of Sark have been caught in the middle of a row about the island's high cost of electricity. The owner of a local power company says he'll pull the plug after the energy regulator ordered it to cut prices. But he says he can't sell electricity at a loss. Our correspondent John Fernandez sent this report from Sark.
That's the hum of the generators powering this island of around 400 people. A sound which could soon stop, because according to the owner of Sark Electricity, David Gordon Brown, a new price control order is putting him out of business.
I came here to give electricity to people of Sark, not to shut it off. But unfortunately, I'm legally obliged to stop selling something that costing me money.
Islanders who only use bikes and tractors to get around are now preparing for the worst, that at midnight tomorrow the power could be switched off. Because for Sark resident Richard Yu, no power means no electricity to pump water from his borehole.
I filled the bath in the bathroom, so we'll have plenty of water to flush the toilet and such like.
At a meeting of the island's government, though, residents were given assurances that contingencies were in place, and Concierge Reg Giel made it clear that those who need help will get it.
We have plans in place. Stocks Hotel has opened itself for the elderly, the infirm and the sick, and those people will be taken care of.
But with negotiations ongoing, the hope is for a last-minute deal to keep the lights on.
That report by John Fernandez. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Alex Ritson. Until next time, goodbye.